Pyzdek Institute.
Good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone, depending on where you're at. My name is Tom Pyzdek, and I want to welcome you to the webinar, Not Just for Manufacturing, DMAIC in a Nonprofit Organization. The presenter this morning will be Richard Petty. Richard is a Pyzdek Institute certified Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, and this is the project that he presented for his certification. I found it to be very interesting. I've had a lot of interest from people who are studying to become certified as green belts or black belts, and they have a lot of questions about what the certification project is like. So I asked Richard if he would agree to present his project to a general audience, and he agreed to do it, and thank you so much, Richard. And I think you'll find this to be an extremely interesting project. It's not a traditional project. It's not something that involves a business process, somebody trying to make money or increase profits or lower costs. But it's a project that's very important. It involves a not-for-profit operation and one of the key processes within that operation. And Richard did a great job on this project, and I'm very proud to have him as one of my certified black belts. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Richard. And Richard, when you're ready, go ahead and share your presentation with the audience. And Richard, it's all yours.
First off, I want to give a special thank you to Tom. One, because quite frankly, I'm a bit of a fanboy of his. And two, for giving me the opportunity to share this non-manufacturing project as a DMAIC case study. I thought that I'd dispense with a standard introduction about my background. That's what I guess the LinkedIn link is for. And to describe to you what I do through the eyes of my children. So mostly it will be through the eyes of a 5- and 7-year-old. They would say that Daddy's job is to help people be happier at work, and that sometimes it means helping a few people play together differently, but sometimes it means rearranging the entire playground to make it more fun for everybody. And when they explained it to me like that, I liked it, especially because it keeps people at the forefront of my job. Well, on to the presentation. The client, which I'll refer to as Need Ministries, short for People in Need, is a nonprofit organization providing more than a half-dozen services, or as they call them, ministries, to their metropolitan community. Theirs is a high-pressure, high-emotion environment in which their clients' needs include medical, food, housing assistance, and even violence prevention, just to name a few. While it looked to me like they were trying to save the world one person at a time, they just thought of themselves as simply giving people a helping hand. Their work makes a significant impact on the lives they interact with, people whom they simply refer to as clients. I was originally asked by their CEO to help them resolve some director-level collaborative conflict, but it quickly became apparent that everyone was passionate, caring, and committed. So my suggestion was to examine the way they were working and how their ministries interacted in order to determine if there were any causes of the conflict. We started our first meeting with the following phrase: there are people problems and there are process problems. Process problems will always cause people problems. Enough directors nodded agreement for us to be able to position our project as solving for problems with their processes, not with their people. Originally, the ministry directors, assistant directors, and the executive group couldn't reach a consensus on which area the improvement project should address. After narrowing it down to 6, they agreed to take a vote. After the vote showed that improving access to a program or ministry service was where they wanted to focus their efforts, we further narrowed the scope of the project to include only existing clients. These are individuals who had already been entered into their radii system, which was their case management software, and had already receive some initial screening as to whether or not they met the general minimum requirements for the specific ministries. Primarily, no record of felonies, not currently a flight from justice, a registered predator, etc. Their business impact statement focused on the fact that they have limited funds with which to serve their clients, and anything that made client access easier would translate to helping more people and therefore better achieving their mission. We also tightened up our problem statement to find what we considered to be a defect in the operational goal. Here's a quick overview of the scope we were focused on. In simplest terms, an existing client had a need. The client was asked to call the assistance line. They went through the assistance line appointment process. The service request was processed, service delivered. In focusing on the appointment process, the client calls, waits on hold, gets an appointment, they show up, they complete some paperwork, they are assessed as to eligibility for the service, and then they're given some recovery expectations, which ideally they accept, and the service gets scheduled for processing. In reality, the only way to get a service was to have it assigned to you by a caseworker. And the only way to meet with a caseworker was to be assigned an appointment. And the only way to get an appointment was to call the assistance appointment line, which several of the directors had nicknamed the meat grinder. When calling, you'd hear a short introduction and please hold recording. Then you would go directly on hold. There was no interaction, there wasn't any hold music, and every minute or so there were clicks on the line followed by continued silence. Many clients hung up due to these false disconnects, as we would come to call them. If you stayed on hold long enough, you would eventually be connected to an assistance line volunteer, and they would schedule you an appointment for the following day, where the caseworker reviews the client paperwork and explains the recovery expectations. If the next day happened to be fully booked, you would be asked to call back tomorrow and try and get an appointment, thereby starting the meat grinder once again, and there end up the call. As for the voice of the customer, I spent several days hanging out in their lobby, just talking to everyone and capturing information from everyone. Their clients were incredibly thankful for everything that they received, but none of them would characterize themselves as being happy with the overall experience. And in many cases, they were so thankful that they apologized on behalf of the pen workers, which spoke to the pen workers' dedication. The outcome of the stakeholder analysis revealed that the CEO, CFO, and Director of Programs, which all ministry directors reported to her, they were very enthusiastic about having a process improvement, as were the Meals on Wheels, the Children's Clinic, and the Family Violence Ministry directors. The Second Chance resale shops and the food pantry directors, along with the IT director, they were somewhat more hesitant, mostly due to a we tried that before mentality. The assistance line director doubted that there was anything her group of volunteers could do, and that most of the work would involve other ministries, quote, changing their ways, end quote. The directors of jobs, program, shelter, and energy assistance and the Interfaith Hospitality Network, they weren't sure what they could do, but they were willing to support anything that helped them help more people. During the vetting of our measurement system, our CTQs boiled down to the following 7 items. The client needed to stay on hold, which meant that they didn't experience a false disconnect due to the clicks they heard while on hold. If you were put on hold, you would eventually be connected to an assistance line volunteer, just so long as you did not hang up. 2, high potential clients, which I'll define in a moment, getting quicker appointments. This CTQ was a highly emotional issue for many of the directors. Their frustration stemmed from the fact that the client had everything they needed to be eligible for service, their paperwork completed, their eligibility requirements met, but they couldn't make it through the meat grinder and get an appointment with a caseworker. Usually this was due to the fact that they had work. They were doing part-time work, or they had to go get their children after work, and they just weren't able to spend what could be up to 2 hours on hold on the assistance line. 3, that the clients bring the required paperwork, all of it, to the original appointment. 4, that the clients meet the eligibility requirements, which were verified by the caseworker during the appointment. 5, that the client accepts the recovery or accountability of the ministry requirements during the appointment. And the recovery accountability was a sort of quid pro quo for the service received. Generally, it was a commitment to return as a volunteer sometime in the future, or accepting that this would be the only monetary subsidy you could receive for the calendar year. Existing clients' inputs consisted of information, some of which required documentation, to ascertain their fit with the eligibility requirements for a given program, and the client's acceptance of the specific recovery expectations or accountability. Once the caseworker had verified the client-side requirements, they would allocate the resources for delivery to the individual, release the resource for delivery to the client by the appropriate ministry. As previously stated, this entire process could be quite lengthy and typically resulted in frustration for all stakeholders. During the measurement phase, we soon discovered that they didn't run reports based upon new versus existing criteria. So the IT director graciously stayed after work and went through Radii, their customer management system, to get the data we needed. The results were that, on average, approximately 70% of the monthly allotment of caseworker time slots were filled by existing clients, about 600 individuals. 14% of the existing clients were no-shows. Now, no-shows included late arrivals who essentially lose their appointment because the caseworkers need the full 30 minutes to be able to get everything done, and they would not get backed up. If you were more than 5 minutes late for your appointment, you were told to call back and make a new appointment vis-a-vis the meat grinder. And that 10% of existing clients don't arrive at their appointment with all of the required paperwork, about 60 a month, which means that they too need to start the appointment process over again. There's some individual charts showing where the data supported that using the previous years. The individual control chart shows a mean of approximately 400 for the previous year, 400 existing clients per month. The P chart for the subgroup number of no-shows, it's relatively stable, and it confirms the previously mentioned mean of approximately 86 new clients per month. The P chart for the number of clients arriving without paperwork, it plotted 2 outliers, one in June and in October. We had some lengthy and heated discussion about the causation of that, but ultimately it was non-definitive, and we just didn't know what caused it. At first, the majority of directors wanted a 5% increase as a goal, but the CEO and I had previously coordinated on asserting the 10% stretch goal, which was ultimately accepted. We won't spend too much time on the as-is process map, except to reiterate that the director of any specific ministry did not have the ability, or frankly the authority, to schedule their own service. That was the realm of the caseworker. After about 2 hours into the analysis of the as-is map, the assistance line director, the one in charge of the volunteers who scheduled the appointments of the caseworkers, she said, if you look at it this way, it looks like my group is the group that needs the most change. At which point, several of the other directors who were sitting behind her turned and looked at each other and nodded their heads. But mainly what it was that she needed to share some of her department's scheduling power. She had reached the moment that I like to call the "it's been you, aha." It's the inevitable moment or moments when analysis of the existing process points to an area that's a primary constraint. I was very happy that she had voiced the conclusion on her own. Some directors had told me the very first day of our project that the assistance line was the problem, but I assured them that our goal was to identify and rectify as many of the issues as possible, not just fix the assistance line. And coincidentally, I've had clients who simply won't accept that they are a contributor to the overall process problems, but that's probably a topic for another webinar. The bottom line of our observations was that everybody was directed to call the assistance line. No matter if you were an existing client or a new or potential client, no matter if you qualified for assistance or didn't qualify. There was virtually no assessment or pre-screening unless you happened to interact directly with the ministry director, which was rare. In doing this, we actively directed people we can never help to the assistance phone line. Or in other words, we unintentionally introduced defects into the system. That was also a heated conversation with the group in getting them to not internalize the fact that the people they were helping were defects, but we worked out the terminology. Further, we recognized that their system really served 4 distinct categories of existing clients, ranging from high potentials, those we could definitely help if we could get them in front of a caseworker quickly, to the no potentials. They no longer meet enough criteria to receive assistance from any ministry. That was typically someone who had committed a felonious crime since they were last entered into the system, things of that nature. The mid and low potentials fell in between, which we identified them as the main categories that really should be sent to the assistance line. Next, we determined that a new process was needed to identify and expedite these now termed high potential clients due to the critical timing for these individuals, and other than the caseworker, only an individual ministry director can evaluate the individual's viability. But even if we could do that, individual ministry directors would need a process to allocate service or self-schedule from within their own ministry. Next was the difficult task of recognizing the necessity of a process to identify no potentials, no matter how painful it might be, and it was quite painful for several of the individuals involved. And we needed to direct them outside the PIN organization. We don't want to waste their time, and there might be another organization that can help them, but it definitely wasn't PIN. That left identifying and directing mid and low potentials to the assistance line, but augmenting the process to give them information earlier in the process in order to prime them for success.
I have a question that relates to what you've recently done here, so I thought I'd ask it now.
Yes, sir.
It says, regarding the point on Part 2B, actively directing people we can't help, is there anything for the nonprofits similar to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which would require the caseworker to make the decision that someone isn't eligible for benefits? Perhaps not telling people about the help services could be interpreted as discrimination if not performed by the caseworker.
Well, in this case, I'm going to answer it from the viewpoint of PIN and the grants under which they operated. They had very specific grant requirements. Most of their funding was from donors, and those donors made those contributions in the form of grants that had specific stipulations. I had mentioned some of them, all of them earlier. You know, they didn't want to have services go to convicted felons for certain programs. As far as making it to where they were maybe pushing them away from the requirements, the caseworkers were familiar with all of the grant requirements, and they would sit and ask questions and check the boxes on the information for that individual and then update their radii entry. So other than intentional malfeasance, I don't see how someone could have pushed someone away or possibly attempted to withhold service, or hey, I don't like the way you smell, and have affected it that way, because all of the criteria was spelled out well in advance, and there was actually a round robin. No caseworker knew who they were receiving until the person walked in the door. Does that answer the question?
I hope so. Jay, if it doesn't, go ahead and ask a follow-up. But go ahead, Richard, move along.
When developing theories of cause and effect, we used the Ishikawa or fishbone diagram, and it was initially very foreign to them, but as soon as we just broke it into pieces, they took to it quite well. I was going to say like a fish to water, but that's too campy. I'll focus on only the assistance line as an example. All appointment slots were filled by 11:30. That was reality. Therefore, the existing client could not get an appointment if they called after 11:30. The PIN staff knew this, but it wasn't communicated to the client base. 2, everyone was directed to the call assistance line, including those no potentials who would take up an appointment slot, but they were still never going to receive a service. So they took up a slot for someone who could potentially receive service. The long hold times led to many individuals hanging up, then calling back, which virtually assured that they wouldn't get an appointment and therefore no service. And then finally, the false disconnects, which was caused by the caller's lack of understanding of the, shall we say, peculiarities of the phone system, that there was no hold music, there would be no updates, you would only hear silence and occasional clicks, all of this which caused most people to hang up and call back. For the failure modes and effects analysis, we'll look at just one item where the volunteer staff doesn't mention anything about eligibility requirements or accountability for receipt of a ministry service. The potential failure effects, the client doesn't have a specific accountability expectation related to receipt of the services. They have, in some cases, unrealistic expectations. They think that they're going to get this help for free. And the client doesn't learn about the requirements until they are actually sitting with the caseworker and have taken up resources and time to get to that point. Potential causes we identified were that the volunteer, the regular volunteer, the daily volunteer or typical volunteer, isn't aware of these requirements or the accountability associated with receiving a specific ministry services. Potential causes on the failure modes set up about the volunteer not being aware of the requirements and therefore contributing to unrealistic expectations. There weren't any informational takeaways to give to clients. There was minimum information on the referral slips they were given, simply the assistance line phone number, operating hours, and a list of the ministries. As far as current process controls, there were no formal controls. Despite there being very specific guidelines associated with each type of ministry assistance, only directors, assistant directors, and caseworkers were fully versed in what they were. The staff may know some of what they were, but they were generally not dedicated to any specific ministry. And in reality, the grant funding and grant requirements could change based upon the length of the grant. I think the shortest grants were about 3 months to 2 years. And so trying to keep everybody informed of all the nuances was just not feasible. This led to a risk priority number totaling 700, 7 in severity times 10 in for occurrence times 10 for detection. The actions recommended were to make sure that the referral slips were available and to modify said referral slips to include some of the major guidelines and additional information, so technically the volunteer can't forget them because they're written down. And then also to modify the volunteer training to include basic understanding of the general requirements and accountability. Instead of simply having them learn them by rote, it moved towards having the volunteer facilitate the brochure rather than try to remember everything they learned in their volunteer training, which was a requirement for them to be a volunteer. Using the FMEA to evaluate the project was a real eye-opener for many of the participants. Several confided in me later that even though they had been doing their job or had been in that position for years, they had never thought about their work function in this way. In determining the improvement strategy, a primary change was to initiate a pre-screening process at the first point of interaction with the client, whether they were a walk-in or a call-in. The primary objective being to identify the high and no potentials for redirection to either the fast track, which I'll outline next, or to an outside agency and out of the PIN system. This would essentially change the purpose of the assistance line from being a catch-all into being a channel for the mid and low potentials. Those are the people who needed more specific review of their individual situation to apply against the criteria that the caseworkers were vetting them against. With the fast track process, the assistance line director gave up some of her power over her organization and her volunteers and put it into the hands of other ministry directors. What I just said sounded pretty easy, but I know it was difficult for the assistance line director, especially after the "it's been you" moment that we experienced during finalization of the current state process map. And to her credit, she handled the transfer of power with grace and dignity. The dedicated appointment process allowed the other ministry directors to use some of the daily appointment slots that the assistance line director had given up, essentially bypassing the assistance line entirely and scheduling a high potential in the very same day. The 2B process map, which was universally accepted, shows the fast track in green, the pre-screening in red, and the dedicated appointment in brown. You can review this if you like when you receive a copy of the presentation, but other than that, it's probably way too small for anybody to see. The improvement plan centered around turning the referral slip into a referral brochure, which I'd mentioned earlier, and marketing it as a kind of repository of knowledge for the ministries, and changing the focus of the training from memorization, which could be forgotten, to facilitation of the brochure, which would make it easier for volunteers. In updating the FMEA, using the same potential failure mode we reviewed earlier, the volunteer staff doesn't mention anything about eligibility or accountability requirements. Changing the current process control included modifying the volunteer and staff training to disseminate the new referral brochure as part of a new pre-screening process. And the actions taken were to give out said new referral brochure and actually review it with the client. The volunteers and staff were trained in how to review it with the client, with the focus on initial screening for potential level, to where they would direct high potentials to a director for use of the fast track system, directing the mid and low to the assistance line, and then directing the no potentials per the brochure to another agency instead of the assistance line. We piloted the children's clinic, measuring for a 2-week trial period. Volunteers and staff were trained to facilitate the referral brochures rather than just pass them out. Accountability was assigned for stocking the brochures. They had a daily touch-base meeting with everyone involved, and they kept track of who was referred where from a potential point of view. The results. For the children's clinic, during the 2-week period, 7 people were pre-screened as fast track. 4 of them were able to receive a same-day appointment. And we had a unexpected bonus that 1 new client was able to be fast-tracked. They just happened to come in with all of the proper paperwork, and even though they weren't in the radii system, there was a fast-track slot available, and they were put in, and they were scheduled for service. We relieve the burden on the appointment line by identifying 12 no potentials and referring them to outside agencies. Another way of saying it, excuse me, is that 12 people did not use up appointments when they were never going to receive any service. And there was a fast-track super story. A mother of 3 was able to be fast-tracked and receive a rent check in 3 business days, keeping her from being evicted from her apartment. She was 3 months past due. And the fastest that a rental check subsidy had normally been able to be delivered was in 10 to 12 business days. The improvement benefits, we were able to help more clients using the exact same amount of resources. They had increased faith that process improvement could measurably help in the delivery of their services. They realized they could work more effectively together and, as someone had put out, not strangle anybody in the process. And that this Six Sigma methodology, which many of them had heard of, and they were like, well, that's for making cars, or that's for creating lamps, or that's for manufacturing. We don't do that. It increased their awareness that that methodology can work with their service model, and they wanted to do more projects. And on a more personal note, the children's clinic director, she came up to me crying one day and gave me a hug because she had been able to get a sick child's mother into an appointment with the caseworker to receive shelter assistance, which wasn't even her ministry, and she was very happy. In implementing the full-scale changes, we finalized the training documentation, made some little tweaks based upon the pilot, and then we decided to roll out the new processes to each ministry, a new ministry, every 2 weeks. We had the caseworkers ask the existing client's experience with the new process. We gave them a checklist to document, were they being told about the new process, how did it happen, and other items like that. And that information was collated and presented by the program director during their monthly meeting. They also added an agenda item, new processes feedback, to their monthly meeting, and set for the very next meeting to determine which specific ministry project they should improve on next. When it came to instituting the control metrics, they continued to monitor for the existing assistance line volume metrics. Each ministry kept track of the number of fast-track and dedicated appointment time slots they used. They also came up with a sort of sub-process where they would trade around their appointments between different ministries based upon who were available, which I thought was a nice collaborative effect. The program director considered having the administrative rep prep all of the assistance line brochures instead of leaving it to the directors. It was easier for one person to do it, and they basically also pointed out that if they did them en masse, they could, save something like $2, and for them, $2 was something worth saving. And then in the following 3 months, approximately 70% of the dedicated appointment time slots were being used by individual ministry directors. And the fast track of clients was working with approximately 8 to 10 of them being fast-tracked and receiving services that same month, 8 to 10 times per month. The silence and clicks continued to be an issue despite communications to clients, but with all of the other improvements, the executive team decided to revisit getting some type of MUSAC system and presenting it forward at the next board meeting. Generally, they didn't use that because of the cost, but once we were able to quantify the cost of not having it, they were more incentivized to review their decision. One interesting but not surprising fact was that they decided to stop keeping data on the no potentials. It basically bummed them out to see a number of people that they had to turn away each week that total to each month, that total to each quarter. And they still turn them away, but they quit keeping track of it. In making the improvements permanent, using the fourth quarter's previous year metrics versus the current year, there was a 19% reduction in existing clients' no-shows. The p-value was below 0.05 and therefore significant. In layman's terms, they went from 91 a month to 73 no-shows a month. They had a 25% reduction in existing clients without paperwork, arriving at their appointment without their paperwork, again with a significant p-value. That's a 66 reduced to 49 per month on average for that quarter, and overall a 12.4 increase of existing clients receiving service in a month. Now the p-value was inconclusive, but we took that before all of the ministries were up and working, and the p-value was 0.065, which isn't bad, especially considering that the 12.4 increase exceeded the initial 10% increase goal. For the transfer of ownership, as of that November 1st, all the directors had adopted the new processes and accepted the new rollout accountability per agreement of the monthly meeting. For the previous year's time frame with the old processes in effect, they averaged 402 existing clients for the fourth quarter. With the new processes in effect, 451.6, which was approximately an extra 50 existing clients receiving services in a calendar month without any change of input of resources. Here's a list of the toll gate and tool checklists. I will not bore you with going through any of those. And Tom, I think we're at a question and answer point.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Richard. Excellent job. Great presentation. And I would like to say that, and Richard, I think, can attest to this, this is the, when you get to the project portion, I take over and start coaching you personally. And this is my opportunity to actually give you some tough love. So when you submit a project like Richard did, you get a lot of feedback from me, and we do a lot of back and forth on these things until the project looks good. And I hope you found that experience to be valuable, Richard, because
I will hereby admit that it was the nicest tough love I have ever received in my career.
So you did a great job. And you know, the other thing is, one of the ways in which I'm blessed is that I get to see projects like this. I feel that Lean Six Sigma has so much to offer the world. And I know that may sound grandiose, but it's true, because there are so many processes out there that could be doing a better job with fewer resources. As Richard showed here, you know, a 12.5% increase in the number of clients served, a reduction in the time wasted. This is all added value, and it's basically free, because we're not adding costs. We're taking cost out and serving more people, producing more products and services. And I think there's an awful lot that we can do here with the tools that we've learned as black belts, above and beyond what we use in our business. So I've got a whole list of questions here, Richard. Let me start with one that came in early, and I'll field this one. Sean asks, at what point do you give up on identifying the cause of an outlier? And you had the experience with your project where you had a couple outliers and gave it an effort in trying to find out what was wrong, and finally just gave up on it and moved on. Do you want to take a shot at answering Sean's question?
You bet. When it came to that, there were differing opinions. And part of that was we were looking at school schedules for people not being able to attend because school had started or school had just ended so that their children needed daycare. We looked at, no joke, we looked at weather patterns for that to see what rainy days, how many rainy days were in those months, because most of their clients did not have personal transportation and relied on public transportation. And we gathered a lot of possible causes, but ultimately we decided that our time would be better spent on what we could determine, although we did gather a significant number of causes. But I would say the main thing that moved us from trying to figure out exactly what it was is because there were 2 or 3 things that logically sounded like they could be the reason, but they also seemed to be mutually exclusive.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is, you gave it a reasonable effort, and at some point you felt that you'd reached the point of diminishing returns and trying to pursue this further. Would that be an accurate statement, a summary?
That is very accurate, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, so basically, folks, when you're trying to identify a root cause, you always have to make a judgment as to when you found the root cause or when you're going to stop trying to pursue it. Because if you look at it from a philosophical perspective, finding the root cause of anything means drilling down to an uncaused first cause. And as you know, philosophers have been struggling with that for thousands of years, and they still haven't reached any consensus on when we've done that. So it's always a judgment call. I can tell you that when you do find special causes and you're able to prove that they are, it's an aha moment, and it's kind of a high. So it's fun, it's worth doing, but typically special cause variation accounts for about 15% of all the variance in a process. So that 85% deserves your priority. Give the special cause the attention it deserves, but not more than that. Here's a question from John to you, Richard. I am curious why you didn't try to abandon the call line and appointment process altogether. Developing a triage capacity on location would allow for many clients to be served in real time and can buffer for no-shows. Adopting a hybrid appointment / walk-up model would allow for level loading.
That would have required a much larger project scope, and this is a project that I did on my own. I had an administrative assistant who came with me that typed up certain bits of information. Where I think that would have basically blown their mind is that what you're talking about is it's making such a change, and the mindset of these individuals is so focused on who they're working with as opposed to how they're working with. And to come in and to suggest something that would be that all-encompassing and all-sweeping, my sense with this group would be that they would be resistant to it because it is so radically different that they would just see it as all of the lost people that they could help.
Okay.
That and the fact that they were, I had a client load I'm working with doing projects with electrical, aerospace, manufacturing, and hospitals all at the same time, and I did play a role in scoping the project based upon my ability, based upon my availability.
And just my take on it is that this would be a process, project that we call a Design for Six Sigma project, which is basically a re-engineering project. Those are generally larger in scope, and they're different in the sense that instead of trying to improve an existing process, we're just going to scrap it and start all over again. And what that often requires is changing compensation, job descriptions, and so on and so forth. It's very radical, and sometimes it is the correct way to go. I've seen those projects produce fantastic results. But in this case, what Richard has done is he's built confidence among the team, and he's also shown them some of the potential that's there, and it would probably be easier after he's done a project like this to get support for trying a project like the one you're suggesting, John. So that's my 2 cents worth. That's all the questions that are up here, and I'm going to go ahead and end this webinar. Again, I want to give my thanks to Richard for doing this, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending.
Pyzdek Institute.